Okay, let's get started. So welcome to the fourth webinar in the Civic Commons Catalyst webinar series. Today, we're following up on the September 11th TD Speaker Series conversation, where we explored the role public assets play in building opportunities for resident participation and belonging within cities and the mechanisms available to build, enhance, and protect these spaces. Ajeev Bhatia from the Center of Connected Communities is joining us, and he's showcasing and unpacking the clips from Tamika, Butler, and Klinenberg, where they framed a conversation about how we create resilient places and communities for people to flourish that Ajeev is going to take further. So thank you for joining us, Ajeev, and I'll intro you in a sec. I think it's always so brave to sit on a webinar with the video on, just waiting. So thank you for being here, and thank you for doing that. A reminder to our participants, if you're new to join us or if you've just forgotten since last time, we're going to be able to ask questions throughout, and Ajeev is going to be moderating that process. So to ask any questions, you can use the chat function, and to make any comments, you can also use the chat function, really testing this idea of being able to create a discussion through that process as well. We thank you for being super interactive for this session, because we really do want to kind of foster a discussion situation happening here. So the webinar is booked for 90 minutes to ensure that our session doesn't end abruptly on the hour, but the programming is only scheduled for 12 to 1. So if you have a meeting invite in your calendar from registering that says it's 90 minutes, don't worry. We are only programming for the 1 hour. And if you have any tech problems while you're here, please feel free to email Jasmine Lefren, who's the person who would have responded to you yesterday, giving you additional details about the webinar. So just to remind you, and we'll drop it in the chat as well, the email address is jlefren@evergreen.ca. And so feel free to contact her if you're experiencing any challenges with your tech and connecting. Great, so thank you for coming and welcome. As a reminder, the Civic Commons Catalyst is the webinar series is part of a larger group of programming where we really explore the spaces that we call Civic Commons that provide community benefit and economic opportunity to residents, and how we might reimagine them, how they might look different, or how they might be better supported. And so the Civic Commons Catalyst programming includes this webinar series as part of a learning network, and we want to explore how a learning network might be launched off of this or work with it. It also includes a participation lab where we're exploring different models for securing the work that Civic Commons and other community hubs do in providing that community benefit to residents. And it involves a community studio, which is a localized opportunity to test participatory models in a community hub setting. The webinar series is one part of this programming, and we're so excited to be hosting you and having you engaged in it today. If you want to learn more about Civic Commons, we will be sending out a link to follow up where you can access some of the stuff that we've written, our website, and a little bit about our plans for the coming year. They're all super exciting, and we'd love to connect with you on what they look like. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ajeev. Ajeev is the Manager of Policy and Community Connections at the Center for Connected Communities. He leads a variety of projects focused on the role of policy and systems on people in place. With over a decade of experience working in community development and grassroots organizing, place-based strategies and philanthropy, along with lived experience. This allows him to look at complex social issues as collective and interconnected challenges requiring impact on multiple scales. And I love a systems thinking head, so I'm glad that we have him with us. A 2018 Places Fellow with the Funders Network for Smart Growth in Livable Communities in the US, and a part-time Master of Planning student, you must be busy, at the University of Toronto, Ajeev is committed to bringing a variety of lenses to work with local systems to create process-oriented solutions effective on the ground. Please join me in welcoming Ajeev, and I really hope that you're clapping by yourselves in your own little spaces. Welcome, Ajeev. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm going to imagine everybody clapping about that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to Evergreen for putting this on. Seriously, thank you for joining us during the lunch hour. I know this is prime time for folks. And so if you're joining us live, I'm really grateful for that. I really am. And for folks who are tuning into the recording, thank you for committing some time to watch this webinar today. So I've been asked to attend the talk given by Eric Klinenberg and Tamika Butler, and to provide some reflections of portions of the talk that I think were interesting, and to kind of reflect and discuss more about them. And so I'm going to be doing that today, but I'm going to be doing that with a lens, and that's the lens of the Center for Connected Communities, which is the organization I work for, and our connected community approach. So I thought it would be great to share with you just a brief overview, a very high-level overview of that approach, before we jump into the discussion for today. So the connected community approach is a set of principles and practices that build on community strengths and assets, so that people, organizations, institutions all contribute positively to the community's development and well-being. So this is an approach that we've pioneered, and we've been around for about a year and a half. So we've actually spun out of the East Scarborough storefront, who has been doing the connected community approach before it was a thing, for about 20 years now. And so a few years ago, we thought about reflecting on the storefront's approach to community development, and began to put some theory behind it, of course rooted in the 20 years of practice of the storefront. And the connected community approach is an issue agnostic approach, meaning that it's not focused on one particular social issue. Instead, it provides a framework for solving complex social challenges. And so that's really, in very broad scopes, how I'll be looking at talks and the clips of the talks today. If you want to learn more about the approach and the work of Center for Connected Communities, you can Google us or visit our website, and there's lots of publications about that. So regarding the talks, when I first heard about kind of Eric and Tamika speaking, I was super excited because Eric Klinenberg's book, Palaces for the People, is a piece that really inspired a portion of the work that we do, specifically around resilience thinking and how neighborhood-based resilience strategies can and should be developed to support neighborhoods as they relate to climate shocks and stressors, but also as they relate to other shocks, such as neighborhood violence. And then I was totally surprised to meet Tamika Butler, who was incredible, who I didn't know a ton about before this talk. But after hearing her and speak and meeting her at the talk, I totally fanboyed about her. She's so amazing. So for me, kind of the Turning Spaces into Places talk was originally going to be specifically about infrastructure, social infrastructure and resilience, because that's how I understood Eric's work. But then after hearing Tamika speak, it really gave me a bit of a license to broaden it out a little bit, to also have kind of a more critical discussion in an awesome way about how we understand turning spaces into places. So with that said, we, I think, cover a lot of ground in the next little while. And so in order to chunk it out, because they're quite unique topics within the broader talks that were given, I've kind of identified 5 topic areas where we'll be spending some time today. And so these are really from the clips, the 5 clips that we will hopefully have enough time to review. So we're going to be talking about what social infrastructure is, what the role is of kind of social infrastructure and resilience, community-led design, building on what's working in communities, and the untapped potential of social infrastructure. So without further ado, let's jump in. If we can move over to slide 3 and play the first clip.
So it's great to be here. I want to talk to you a little bit about this project and where it came from. And the book Palaces for the People is about this concept that I call social infrastructure. And I know that's a weird and wonky and new term for a lot of you. And so I just want to tell you as we get started, when I say social infrastructure, what I'm referring to are the physical places and the organizations that shape the way that we interact with each other. And I've come to see social infrastructure as being just as real as the infrastructure that we have for water or for power or for communication. It's something that is vital to our social life. And when we invest in it, if we take good care of it, if we maintain it, if we program it well, there are all kinds of benefits that we get. But unfortunately, if we neglect it and we stop building it well and we let it fall apart, we become all the more likely to kind of hunker down and spend time on our own. And it's the argument of my book that over the last several decades, we haven't just failed to invest in the hard infrastructure that tends to dominate our conversation about city making. We've also really neglected social infrastructure, and we pay a price for it. And in a way, my work on this book began when I started doing this project on Sandy that you just heard about. You probably remember Superstorm Sandy, and it was a hurricane before it got to New York City. It produced this image. I'm guessing this image is familiar to you. Has anyone seen this image before of Manhattan after the storm hit? It's kind of a remarkable thing because no one really believed that you could have a power outage in the center of the world for finance and for business and for capital that would last 5 or 6 days, but that's what Manhattan looked like for a long time. And you know, there's this funny thing in the United States. These are just scenes from, this is the Lower East Side. There's an idea that when the federal government comes in to try to help a municipality or a state recover after a disaster, they refuse to give money for projects that make a place better than it was before. The rule is, because the federal government's a little bit skeptical of local governments, that you can build back just what was there before, but you can't make it better. And that's a strange idea because we live in a time now where, you know, scenes like power outages in major cities and catastrophic flooding in neighborhoods that seem like they would stay dry are becoming more and more common.
Thank you. So in this very early portion of Eric's talk, he defines a social infrastructure. And so the definition he gives is the physical places and the organizations that shape the way we interact with each other. And so this is the kind of traditional way in which we generally understand social infrastructure. It's the physical component of things that bring people together, the physical spaces and places, by that I mean. And so what we at C3 have really been thinking about is broadening out that definition, because we believe that it's not just the physical portion, but also the non-physical portion of social infrastructure that is so critical. And so for the next couple of slides, I want to tease out a little more the difference between form and function, and how both the physical and the non-physical components of social infrastructure are so key. A bit of a working definition that we have over here, because this is something that we're kind of thinking more about, is that social infrastructure is the physical and non-physical spaces, networks, relationships, communications in communities which uphold and strengthen community social fabric and social cohesion. So we're saying that it's not just a physical space that is mandated or that has a potential to bring community together, but it's actually the functions of that space that are so critical. And by creating both physical and non-physical spaces, networks, and connections, we're investing in this kind of invisible glue in our communities that strengthen the social fabric and do things like address social isolation and lead to strong and inclusive communities. An example of this that I'd like to share is Faith in the Common Good, which is this interfaith national, I believe, kind of network of faith-based organizations who, as we know in communities, faith-based organizations play such a critical role as, you know, in the broadest term, kind of a community hub, a space where people come together. But faith in the common good has taken it a bit further by recognizing that by holding a network of faith-based organizations and filling this gap of providing a focus that is beyond their four walls as faith-based institutions, to think community-wide in order to strengthen the priorities of the neighborhoods that these faith-based organizations are in. They are functioning with coordination and communication across the communities that they're working in. They're functioning as a network across the nation of faith-based organizations who are building out processes and approaches which don't just rely on their physical space in the community, but what exactly the types of coordination, communications, being intentional about holding relationships in neighborhoods, cultivating those relationships, understanding who the other players are in communities and connecting with them. And so those components that might seem invisible for physical social infrastructure spaces is so powerful. And we see more examples on the next slide as libraries, which Eric is a huge fan of. He talks about libraries as this really perfect social project that ended up being so impactful for communities. And it's something that, he talks to great length about how libraries are now seeing underinvestment and disinvestment from the state. And so the physical social infrastructure that libraries offer needs to be upheld and maintained and continue to be invested in, because we've got something so right working here. But I think libraries also, it's the functions of these libraries that are so critical. In my neighborhood in Scarborough, which is an inner city suburb of Toronto, we know that the branch library here is so amazing. They have an entire communication strategy for the neighborhood in terms of how they're sharing knowledge from the city about programs and services, but beyond that, to communities. Librarians are incredible relationship brokers. They know so many people in communities, and they're a face that's so familiar to people. And so they do this types of knowledge sharing. They do the relationship brokering, and they build out communication strategies that, although are specific to their library, they're also community-wide. And so they're taking this broader lens to sharing communications and information in communities. And so it goes beyond just the fact that this is a physical building where you can walk in and feel welcomed and have space. But it's really the function of libraries about how they are holding relationships, how are they're disseminating knowledge in community, that is also so key and makes them such vital components of our neighborhoods. And so if we're flipping over to the next slide, what does this definition, this broader kind of abstract, ambiguous definition of both the physical and the non-physical social infrastructure really look like in practice? And so if you could flip to the next slide, we know that, community hubs nowadays mean everything and nothing, depending on who you are and your perspective on them, but they are absolutely critical to the health of communities. And so, when we're thinking about what good social infrastructure looks like, we really like to think about the function, the form follows the function. And so, the East Scarborough storefront pictured here is an example of what some people might have described as a community hub. It's a co-location of social services, but over the 20 years, it's gone way beyond that. And so they've spent 20 years thinking about, well, what exactly is the function? Because we know service delivery in communities are critical, and so we will kind of co-locate social services here, but our core function isn't that. Our core function is to be a community backbone organization. It's where we prioritize convening people in the community. We prioritize knowledge sharing, relationship building, facilitation, bringing multiple people in the community who have similar goals and visions for the priorities of their neighborhood, and bringing them together and strategically facilitating a process where people whose goals are aligned are addressing their kind of their agendas and their issues without compromising that, and while doing so, advancing the entire priorities of the work that they're doing, but also the community. And so what's key about community backbone organizations is that they have this community-wide lens as a part of their work, and they're connecting other actors in the neighborhood. And so if we can flip over to the next slide. One of the foundational pillars to building social infrastructure, and on the non-physical side of things, is it really comes down to relationships. Who's holding them in communities? Who is connecting folks? And this means looking at communities from not just the grassroots level, but also the organizations and service providers in those communities, along with local government and funders and et cetera. And so on the next slide, this is some of the work that the storefront and now what we're doing at C3 has been thinking a lot about, which is this piece about who exactly are in neighborhoods and how are we being intentional about connecting people. So this is a diagram of the different kind of actors you might find in a neighborhood. And typically, people aren't really connected. These different actors, from business to grassroots leaders to policy folks, they're actually not connected, although they might be running programs, initiatives, and projects that are tackling similar issues or challenges. They're not speaking to one another. And so on the following slide is what's possible when there is some social infrastructure in neighborhoods, that non-physical piece and it's being prioritized. And so the idea here is that not one person is holding all of the relationships in a community, which may typically happen if we're working specifically with kind of hubs, but that relationships and folks who aren't traditionally connected are being intentionally connected to by people who are implementing kind of the role of that social infrastructure and are being intentional kind of community backbone folks to be connecting others in neighborhoods. So for that piece, if you go on to the next slide, I'm gonna pause there. I talked quite a bit, and I really want to open up the question to the audience here about, how are you defining social infrastructure? Do you think it's more about the way Eric is thinking about it around that physical dimension of kind of a civic commons where people are coming together and that's more or less it? Or is there the non-physical component as well, where the function of that social infrastructure is critical to galvanizing community? Is it both? Is it neither? So if anyone has any input, questions, comments, stories, please share in the chat box now. I'm gonna pause for a minute. Okay, so we don't have tons of questions coming in, so I'm gonna continue to the next slide, which is a second clip, and we'll be monitoring the chat box as well, if any questions do come up around there. And so if you want to hit play.
Because one of the big themes of my book is that we're going to be spending a lot of money on infrastructure, inevitably. And if we just build for a kind of 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 year problem, we're going to wind up in a really ugly world. But if we build infrastructure systems with both a security concern in mind, but also with the question of how do we build an infrastructure that makes life better in this place every day, then we get something really special. And they said, we've been thinking about how to do this, and we've come up with this idea. We have a prototype for a whole new building that we're inventing, a whole new structure, and we're calling it a resilience center. Any of you here work in climate, space, and urban issues? Anyone here really been tuned into this debate about climate? Have you heard that word resilience a lot? That word is everywhere. Right? It's a big buzzword of our time. And I said, okay, like, I'm interested, but tell me what you mean by Resilience Center. And they said, okay, Eric, imagine if you had a building. We're going to prototype it in this one neighborhood, they said, but we really think this is a scalable thing. A building that was a public building. It was open, 5, 6, or 7 days a week, and it was meant to be a kind of home away from home. A place where everyone in the neighborhood knew they could go and always be welcome. So the doors are open most of the time. It's very accessible. It's staffed by professionals whose job is to be like aggressively welcoming, which is kind of how I think of Canadians, like aggressively welcoming, it's like, please come, And we'll program the building so people find it very appealing. The Resilience Center has to be for everyone, but the people who are most vulnerable, who are going to need the Resilience Center the most, are very young people and also very old people, because they're more bound to the neighborhood, right? And they said, we know that young people don't just come to the Resilience Center on their own. Young people have grown-ups, and so you need to figure out a way to bring them both. So like for young people, maybe we would do story time in the morning at the Resilience Center. We could do sing-alongs. Maybe we do some arts and crafts classes and things like that, just like nice community programs. And they said because they're going to come with these grown-ups, maybe we'll have like some comfortable seating for them. We could have Wi-Fi access, some machines around. We really want to make it a place where they can get to know each other too. And they said for older people, a similar set of programs would really work in a Resilience Center. Like we could have a book group, we could have a current events class. Maybe we'll do some kind of film series. Maybe we'll have some special programs where the older people and the younger people will get together. And they said, look, Eric, we're so excited about this Resilience Center idea. Honestly, we think that within a small number of years, we're going to have demand from cities everywhere. And honestly, that the Resilience Center could go anywhere in the city, anywhere in the world. What do you think? And I've been teaching in universities for a long time, so I'm used to people pitching new projects. And I know that no matter what anyone has just presented me with, that the best thing I can say at first is always like, well, that's a really interesting idea. It's really exciting. And I did that. I said, I think that's a really interesting idea. And then I paused for a minute and I said, have you ever heard of a library? Because it seemed to me like what these guys had done in coming up with this great design idea for the Resilience Center is they had just reinvented the wheel.
Resilience has been a hot topic lately. We know climate change is rapidly accelerating, and as a result, shocks in neighborhoods, climate-related shocks are getting worse, and so more and more people are talking about resilience. We've been doing some work around neighborhood-based resilience strategies. So our approaches are always place-based, and what this looks like. And Eric has a great point around the fact that libraries are key pieces that we can be leveraging for neighborhood-based resilience strategies. But we started thinking more, and if you could go to the next slide, about those functions again. What is the role of an organization as it relates to neighborhood-based resilience? So what is needed in community in order to adjust the way the current system, the way the government system is both understanding the efforts that are happening in community, and at the same time community is being coordinated, and the actions of community are being coordinated during a time of a shock. And so, this role of the community backbone organization, the example that I shared about the East Scarborough storefront, and the functions of that community backbone organization to be a network weaver in communities, to understand who's doing what in communities and how to connect them, to be a communicator locally in the community, in the neighborhood that we're working with, but also upstream to the city, to translate across sectors, to be a champion of grassroots groups in those neighborhoods, and to be a liaison between kind of emergency responses from the system and community-led strategies that occur. And if we go to the next slide, I think that we can expand on the thinking of Eric to say that we already have libraries. We don't need to invest in more buildings to build kind of neighborhood resilience. But our approach here is, again, we have the physical spaces and purpose-built spaces. What we need to be investing in is the functions and expertise of those. And so, you know, on this slide, we really identify, well, who's already in community? And let's take an asset-based approach. Like, let's look at community strengths. Who's already in community that could play the role of doing this neighborhood resilience work? And so, you know, there are organic groups and organizations, grassroots folks that emerge from neighborhoods that have been doing work around advancing the priorities of their community for years, for decades, and so those exist. But also, to my previous example around faith in the common good, there are faith-based communities in a lot of, if not all, neighborhoods. And so, you know, can these also be resilience centers or spaces? Libraries, of course, and also resident associations. So wherever there are, or there's an ability to work with, and these can also be considered as a kind of social infrastructure on the physical end. And so if, you know, if we know that these exist, can we invest in supporting the function of these groups to play that resilience role as well? So yes, libraries and then on the next slide is an example of what this had looked like more or less in practice. So the reason why we're doing more thinking around the work of neighborhood resilience is really because of a mass shooting that happened in my neighborhood here in West Hill, which is a neighborhood in Scarborough. And the role that the storefront played as a community backbone organization to coordinate, to communicate, and to leverage both the resources at a system level and also the resources from community on a grassroots level, and the effectiveness that had for this community to respond, to prepare, respond, recover, and regroup in order to mitigate future shocks. And so when we talk about regroup as a part of a resilience strategy, this is also language we're trying to further refine, but we're thinking about bouncing forward. So we're saying that it's not enough in the face of a climate shock for a community to respond to it and recover. But if we know that shocks are compounded and disproportionately affect marginalized communities, how are we investing in neighborhoods to address the systemic challenges that give kind of the creation of the stressors? So we're talking about poverty, systemic racism, these critical pieces. And so this regrouping piece is so key to that. And I just want to emphasize that with this approach, we're not talking about downloading responsibility onto communities. This approach actually requires the way in which typical city response or system response functions to change, to recognize that communities are already organized. There are ecosystems where grassroots groups and residents are doing incredible work, and to recognize that there's knowledge and wisdom and power in communities, and that in the face of climate shocks and other shocks in neighborhoods, that there needs to be a coordinated effort between community and systems. So on the next slide, I've just asked a question here. How can Civic Commons play a role in resilience? And so again, if folks are interested in sharing a little bit about this particular topic as part of the discussion, please do in the chat box. We're also going to unmute folks' mics at the end of this webinar so that we can have a bit of a discussion for a few minutes, if that's better for folks as well. And so we're just going to move on to the next slide, which is another video from Tamika, who really is a powerhouse who takes the stage and talks about community-led design. So let's listen to that.
Power. And if what we're ultimately trying to get to is equity, we can't get there without inclusion. And people like to say diversity and inclusion, but the reality is they're not the same, and they don't always come together. And too often, those of us who are diverse know we're being tokenized, because you just want us there. You don't actually want us to say anything. So every time you see a fashion designer who puts out a hoodie with the noose around the neck, and everybody's like, how did that happen? Were there no people of color who worked there? The answer is yes, people of color definitely worked there. They were all around the table being like, yo, did you see that hoodie? That's not gonna go well on Twitter. But they are not the decision makers. They do not have the power to say that can't happen. And that's what true inclusion means. And then we can start talking about equity. And I actually like to say inequity, because that's actually what we're talking about, the inequities that have been built into our spaces. And in its simplest form, equity means giving people who have historically had the least the most. And that's really hard, right? Because what no one likes to talk about in placemaking and urban planning and city building, like the dirty little secret is that this work is political. And when work is political, it's really hard to get an elected official to say, you're right. We've had it really good over here for a long time, so I'm just gonna go out and tell my constituents we're good and to give it to those people over there. No one's gonna do that. It's really hard to get someone to do that. But it doesn't mean that's not what we should be going towards. And frankly, equity is where we are at now. That's what people are comfortable with. But what we should really be fighting for is liberation. What we should really be fighting for is freedom. But we don't have that slide because I don't know if you guys are ready yet for that one. But we do have power. And I've mentioned power a few times. As I said, I'm from Nebraska. I'm from the Midwest in the United States. Kanye West, one of our greatest figures in the Midwest, until he wasn't. But he has the song, right? No one man should have all that power, right? And power is the ability to get what you want. And everyone does not have power to get what they want. But that doesn't mean there's not a difference between power with people and power over people, right? Because the reality is sometimes we think only certain people have power, but the communities we're working in, they already have power. They're already the experts. And so if we can stop thinking in a colonial mindset of let's have power over people and empower them, and instead think let's have power with people and co-power them, and let's realize them as the experts they already are. There was this project in LA where people kept dying getting across the street. And so the experts with the power came in and said, we're gonna switch the layout of this street. And so they made all these changes, they made all these investments, they changed the signal timing, they changed the width, they put in some crosswalks, and then people kept dying, and they couldn't figure out why. They talked to people in the community finally, and what people said in this low-income community of color is, this is the only tree we have on this street, and it's on this side of the street, and the bus stop's on this side of the street. And so you can put crosswalks in at the intersection, but our elders are not gonna walk to the intersection to catch the bus. They're gonna sit in the shade, and then when they see the bus coming, they're gonna try to get across the street. And that's why people keep dying. And if those experts from the city had a framework of having power with people instead of power over people and trying to empower people to cross the street safely, if they instead said, we're gonna co-power people to co-design with us how we're gonna get across the street safely, they could have saved a lot of money.
Oh my God, I love Tamika so much. So we're shifting gears now from resilience and social infrastructure to equity and inclusion in planning and city building. And so, I want to ask you all, what does a framework of having power with people look like in community as it relates to planning? And so that question's coming up. But on the next slide, I'm sharing a little bit about how we've done it through a connected community approach through a project called the Community Design Initiative. And so the Community Design Initiative was this project where the East Scarborough Storefront that community backbone organization I spoke about inherited a old cop shop. It was a police subdivision. So jail cells and security cameras and concave security mirrors and you name it, it was a jail. And so we had inherited it, but this was supposed to be a community space. and it was the furthest thing from it. So Community Design Initiative was a project that centered young people from the community and brought in professionals from architecture, engineering, planning, and design to work with these young people over the course of a couple of years to invest in building relationships and trust so that both the professionals can learn about what it meant to authentically engage and build relationships in that community and learn from the young people. So there's this inherent recognition of who has knowledge and who's producing knowledge, and that in fact is community as well. And then the professionals providing some kind of teachings around just how to read blueprints, like basic blueprints and color theory and that sort of thing. That was a project that I was involved in a decade ago that really carved kind of a great path in my life. And so on the next slide, the approach to Community Design Initiative was working with the right professionals who were values-based and understood and had humility that there was a lot to learn from community. And so it was intentionally designed from the ground up to be cognizant of power dynamics that exist and to take the lead from community about what their priorities were. So I love this saying, professionals on tap, not on top. This was from another project with a similar kind of values base called Tent. And it was working with folks like Jillian Mason to work with residents to learn software like SketchUp so that they can actually map out their community, which on Google Maps didn't actually, it was two-dimensional, and so they got to make it three-dimensional. So it was an extremely powerful experience, and for me on the next slide, it really resulted in when we listen to community deeply, we understand their priorities and their needs, we're able to support the design of something great. And so this is a first in the world kind of skyoswale. It's an elevated bioswale. So it reduces it does stormwater management. So it reduces rainwater runoff. It collects water in a cistern underneath that then can be used for the community garden that backs up onto that as well. And the power of this program, this connected community approach to community-led design, the social capital, I think that was exchanged through that program was incredibly powerful for me, along with many other young people in that program. We had folks who went off to design school, who went off into, I believe, engineering, and I've just started a path in planning. And so that was all inspired by this co-powering of community design. And so over to the next slide is a question for any of you, if you have other frameworks or ideas for how we can have power with communities in planning. And so if you can park this question, because we'll open up the discussion right afterwards. And so the last thing I think I want to do is go over to the next slide, which is another video clip from Tamika. And so I just want to play that, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion right after this clip. So let's listen in.
Let's talk about placemaking. And placemaking is important here. And this is from that same report that basically found that even though people feel connected to their communities, more can be done here in Ontario. That there still needs to be trust built by putting together more of these pieces of social infrastructure, as Eric would say, bringing together diverse groups, even the folks who are marginalized and disadvantaged. And that when you create these safe and attractive public spaces, that's when people can really play freely, meet each other, interact, and that this has to be part of the policy here. So it seems like you all do get that this social infrastructure is really important. And so where is the gap? Why are we still struggling with what placemaking means? And I think part of the reason is because we still have this framework of if we build it, they will come. And the reality is that some of us don't feel comfortable coming. Or when we get there, we are shown so many signs that we don't belong. And it starts with this framework of placemaking. We go in as these experts and we say, we're gonna, make places. We're gonna create social infrastructure. When in reality, many of the places we're going to are already places. They're just not places for us. The one thing that is true is that we're all settlers if you're not indigenous, right? All of these places were places before we ever got here. And so if we can't go in with that humility, that in placemaking we first have to acknowledge the history of places, then whatever we create isn't going to be that authentic space we're hoping for. And that's thinking about those different issues. That's living life at the intersections. I always say you can't, as a planner or as an engineer, have somebody come to you and say, this intersection is a mess, fix it. And say, that seems really hard. Can I just make a parklet mid-block and call it good? Because you wouldn't be doing your job. But for some reason, when we have to think about placemaking and affordable housing and sexism and colonialism, that feels scary. And so we don't do it. But the reality is there are some of us who live at the intersections every single day. We have to be there. When I walk into a room and someone grabs their purse, I don't know if it's because they see that I'm black. I don't know if it's because they think I'm a black man. I don't know if it's because they think I'm a brash and a loud American. I don't know. But I'm constantly thinking about all of those things because I live at the intersections. And for those of us who, again, don't think about these things and have the privilege not to live at the intersections, how do we force ourselves to do it?
So such an incredible speaker. I really encourage you all to check out that video if you have a chance. But at the moment, I want to stop and open it up for discussion to the group. So we're going to unmute mics. And so please take it away, folks.
I'm going to actually ask anybody who does want to contribute to unmute their own mics, just because I don't want somebody to be at home with a baby and have their mic suddenly unmuted, that kind of thing. So jump in if you'd like to. Do you want to rephrase the question, Ajeev?
Yeah, I mean, so we touched on several topics, so maybe I'll go over those quickly. We talked about the definition of social infrastructure. Is it physical? Is it non-physical? We talked about the role of social infrastructure and neighborhood-based resilience. And then we also talked about equity and inclusion in planning and social infrastructure. And so I think if anyone has anything to share around a particular story, a framework, any questions or thoughts that came to mind on any of those topics, please feel free to discuss.
Hi, Ajeev. This is Marina.
Hi, Marina.
How are you? You were fantastic connecting all the dots. I'm jumping in to see if I break the ice. And just to say that you did wonderfully in sort of bringing the talk and the connection with the work that you're doing. And I think maybe why everybody's quiet is that we agree. I have been practicing on the ground with communities, and I think it is key to social infrastructure and to building a healthy civic commons, both the actual physical places, having places with a proper infrastructure, and in Canada and cities like Toronto or cities that are cold is having infrastructure both in winter and in summer, which is one of the biggest problems that we faced in our cities, is that everybody's happy and outdoors during the summer months, but then come winter, we don't have proper physical infrastructure to ensure that community still comes together in those long winter days. But also key to that process is to have the programming. And I think that's one of the problems that we're having in many of our public spaces, is that there's no money for programming. And so programming allows for people to come together and have an excuse to talk to one another and build those relationships that lead to a strong social infrastructure that will help us react in difficult times, both because you have those local community champions that start to build relationships with residents, but also because those residents then build those relationships with the community champions and other members in their neighborhoods that will allow them to react in difficult times and don't depend on government action when there is a climate change situation. And so I think as a practitioner, we've known this, and I'm pretty frustrated when they keep on asking us, what do we need to build a resilient city? And we come up with new strategies when the strategies are already there and they're happening in communities. So that's what I have to offer. And I'm going to just allow others to comment.
Thank you for sharing.
I think from my perspective, I really like how you brought together Tamika and Eric's comments, because I think especially in low-income neighborhoods or neighborhoods with very little social infrastructure and infrastructure that's constantly being defunded, I think there are additional barriers to being able to feel like you're entitled to change the space that you're in, and entitled to create community organizations. And I think there's in the model that you're playing with resilience, there's a co-powering, empowering, whatever you want to call it, of entitlement. And that in itself can change how the system works together and how people feel like a community should be reflective of them. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, I think what was so powerful about Tamika, and it was such a great balance as well, for inviting both of them to speak on very interesting perspectives about what's needed to build strong social resilience, is that, you know, we're always asking community to change the way it operates and it's doing, without taking into account the complexity of a neighborhood ecosystem and the effectiveness that already exists in communities. And so a lot of the time, you know, when we're championing for systems change, what we're talking about is, you know, how is the existing city structures, government structures at whatever level, shifting in order to move away from a colonial way of doing, offer more of its power, let go of some more of its power, and recognize where there's inherent knowledge in community and be able to tap into that in a way that's not extractive, but in a way that supports the current ongoings in neighborhoods. And so part of that is really bringing to light and amplifying all of the incredible grassroots work that's happening in every neighborhood across this country. A lot of it is invisible. These are folks who have dedicated decades of their lives to doing good work, but don't have charitable status, don't have websites, don't have official organizations. And so it's about connecting these two and who is going to be playing that role to do that.
Unless there are any other burning comments or questions, I'm going to wait like 3 seconds to make sure that that's the case. Okay, I want to thank you, Ajeev, for joining us. And thank you, the group, for joining us. Even though we don't always get questions, we do get emails afterwards and comments on how it went. So I'll be sure to share, and we'll follow up in an email with some of the major takeaways from today. But I want to thank everybody for joining us and for continuing to be engaged in our community or Civic Commons work, particularly how it ladders up to the Civic Commons Catalyst and the suite of programming that we're doing. So we appreciate that quite a bit, and we appreciate Ajeev being able to share his wisdom with us. And I invite you to keep your fingers on the pulse of what C3 is doing, because they are doing some really great things, and in really bringing to the fore the role of that community organization, and centering different forms of community knowledge than we've typically seen. So excited about the work that you're doing and excited to stay connected. Yeah, so thank you. Our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, October 15th from 12 to 1. We'll be exploring adaptive reuse projects with integrity. So with aging building stocks, growing populations, and booming real estate markets, adaptive reuse projects have grown in relevance and popularity. Entremise Montréal and New Dawn Enterprises are going to explore participatory models for restoring and repurposing underutilized public infrastructure. So this is actually going to be focused on the physical social infrastructure that we talked about, even though there are other forms. And understanding how you do that with and for community. So what that co-powering might look like. I'll be your host again, Ayana Webb, a program manager at Evergreen. And I hope to see you all there. We'll send a follow-up email with information on how to stay up to date on the upcoming webinars and to learn about the Civic Commons Catalyst. And just continue to follow us monthly in a series of sharebacks from the Civic Commons in our webinars, where we're showcasing leading ways that unique participatory Civic Commons are trying different initiatives. So our upcoming topic is from consultation to co-creation, and learning how to move up that ladder of participation. If you're interested in being showcased, reply to our follow-up to this webinar, and we'll get in touch to explore your involvement. We're really looking at showcasing the voices of people who come from community hubs or Civic Commons and are working on really interesting things. And in the future, we also have a connection with Beta City YEG, which is one of the online or not in person social infrastructures that are going to share their roles in promoting participation. So keep an eye on the rest of the series, and we hope to see you out next time. Thank you for joining us.